what's lacking from the allopathic model is any awareness of the menstrual cycle whatsoever, any awareness of how a woman's fertility works. Things that I often talk about is the lack of awareness just in the basics. You're not fertile every single day. There's a fertile window that we can identify by tracking your cervical mucus, your basal body temperature, those fertile signs. And also your fertility changes with age. You're not going to have the same exact fertility as you would at 20 when you're in your 40s. We're not having that conversation. These couples are not aware of the role of male factor. We've already mentioned that. That's a pretty big deal. And the way women live their lives at this stage in time is that we are typically avoiding pregnancy, of course, in our late teens and our early 20s. We're often using hormonal methods for that, but we're not getting educated about how those methods work and how they may affect fertility, compounded by how your fertility changes over time.
Ooh, Dalali. My goodness, I was lucky enough to score two amazing guests for today's podcast. Lily Nichols, who's a registered dietitian, probably doesn't need much introduction, nor does my other guest, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, who's a fertility awareness educator, perhaps the best known fertility awareness educator, at least in North America, if not worldwide, as far as my experience tells me. Both of these women have authored their own books. Lily has two. One is called Real Food for Pregnancy. And then there's one that's a little bit more niche for people who develop gestational diabetes, Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. And those are two, they were like instant classics because they were a reflection of the amazing amount of research that Lily has put into a free blog, which can be found at her website. We'll link everything in the podcast description, so don't worry about writing anything down here. She is the bridge between the food world and the birth world. And for that, we love her. We are very grateful. Lisa has focused on helping women understand their cycles through fertility awareness tracking, which pretty simply put is when you're tracking your cervical position, cervical fluids, basal body temperature, and maybe some other symptoms on a regular basis so that you can map out when exactly is your fertile window. And of course, during your fertile window, it's a maybe 5 to 7 day period. That's when you can, if sperm are introduced, that's when you can get pregnant. Ideally, sperm are introduced in a copious amount before the egg is even released. And when you are tracking your fertility through these various metrics, you can get a pretty good idea, number one, as to whether or not you are healthy, which reflects the name of Lisa's first book, which is called The Fifth Vital Sign. But also, it'll tell you when to have sex so that you can optimize the chances that you're going to conceive naturally. Well, these two women have combined forces to create a new book, Real Food for Fertility. They sent me a copy, and holy shit, guys, this is so chock full of information that they didn't even include the citations in the book itself because there were over 2,400. So you go to the website, realfoodforfertility.com. You can read the first chapter of the book at no cost. And you can get the full list of citations there, which, thank goodness somebody's put this together, because for a while there, I was referring people to different books for these various topics, and now we've got it all in one place. So there are a lot of great other resources out there, but Lily and Lisa found time in their already busy schedules, between giving talks worldwide, to writing blog posts, to doing personal coaching and counseling and training, to write this book for the betterment of any couple out there that is, has a glimmer in their eye and wants to get pregnant. Or a couple that is struggling with fertility from the beginning. And if you ultimately end up going the assisted reproductive technology route, IVF, IUI, everything in this book is just as valuable for you. This is not just, hey, natural conception or bust. This is about getting your health in order. And as Lisa's book title suggests, The Fifth Vital Sign, if you don't have regular menstrual cycles 12 to 13 times per year, there might be something upstream that should be rectified, especially if you go down the path of assisted reproductive technology, because ART, specifically IVF, carries with it a bunch of risk factors in pregnancy, independent of all the other variables. So There is a reason to be thoughtful about your menstrual cycles. There's a reason to be thoughtful around your ability to conceive whenever you and your partner are ready. And it's important to be thoughtful that while not everything is controllable in pregnancy, the various nutritional and lifestyle factors to improve the chances of natural conception. And the two things that we focus on in this podcast, of course, we could have gone for 10 hours, but we focused in 1 hour on egg quality and sperm quality. And that in and of itself, there is just a treasure trove of information. This is a real show, guys. We're doing this live. So fortunately, they come on. They gave some of their very limited time, very gracious with their time to explore some of these topics. And like I said, while not everything is controllable, the way that you treat your body, both for the man and the woman. And by the way, guys, I think that most of you are being let off the hook when I would suspect 60 to 70% of fertility challenges are due to you. And you've been told you have normal semen or sperm count, normal whatever. But those lower limits of normal, I'm using air quotes on my end, are really only valuable when we're talking about the likelihood of success if you invest the $15,000 or more into IVF. So buckle up, buckaroos. This one is a joy. Of course, this podcast is like my passion. This is the thing I do where I get to talk to interesting, compelling, intelligent people like Lily and like Lisa. But it comes out of my pocket. So I've got two brands who support the show. The first is Immune Intel AHCC. Active hexose correlated compound is a compound derived from the mycelia of shiitake mushrooms. That's the part that grows under the soil. When you take this and extract this HCC, this particular compound, it can be used for a variety of different health issues. And the reason that they're aligned with my show is because I'm using it to support women with persistent HPV positive swabs, which likely reflects some degree of cervical dysplasia or inflammation in the reproductive tract. So when I get women taking this, they go back to their doctors and the problem, in most cases, I'm not going to say every case, in most cases is resolved or at least starting to regress. So HCC is a necessary part of anybody's lifestyle program. I take a bottle every 3 to 4 months just to keep myself up to speed, get my immune system remodulated, of course, with the changing seasons, with various environmental things that are going on, traveling so much between the West and East Coast, not to mention to Europe. My immune system takes a hit just like anybody else. And despite eating organ meats and fermented cod liver oil and bone broth and eggs and smoked oysters, all of which are part of Lisa and Lily's program, by the way, for optimal health and fertility, sometimes I do need a little boost. And so I take a bottle of this, even though I don't have any real reason to believe that my immune system is not going to be able to do its three primary jobs: heal wounds, fight off infection, or clear out precancerous cells. So Immune Intel is a part of my regimen. I think you're going to really dig this company. Go to themedicine.com. That's THEMEDICIN.com. Use code beloved10. You'll save 10%. If you enroll in our Clear and Free program, clearhpv.com, you get a free bottle of Immune Intel AHCC because it works just so well. So that's our first. The other is my preferred prenatal vitamin, which is called WeNatal. Has all of the adequate amounts of things that you're looking for: methylfolate, vitamin D, choline, the range of other B vitamins. It has all of that packed in there in 3 capsules instead of maybe 10 capsules, which you can get from some of the other leading brands. They're also very, very connected to the mind-body experience of, this preconception through pregnancy and childbirth experience. They're very eco-conscious, very minimal packaging. Everything about this brand I love. And I'm so happy to have one brand that I can point everybody to. All of my clients are taking it. All of our Born Free community members are taking it. This is the new thing. That's why Dr. Mark Hyman of the Institute for Functional Medicine, who also has a great podcast, that's why he is also behind this brand. I feel like I'm like on a stage with a giant there. WeNatal.com/beloved if you want to check out their supply. When you use that link or code beloved at checkout, and you're going to purchase a prenatal vitamin, add a bottle of their Omega DHA Plus, a high quality fish oil, add that to your cart and see what happens. Magically, that fish oil is going to become free to you at no cost as a listener of the show. So support WeNatal, support Immune Intel AHCC. I love these guys. So happy and grateful to have them on board. All right. Without further ado, here is my beautiful conversation with Lisa Hendrickson-Jack and Lily Nichols. All right, Lily Nichols, Lisa Hendrickson-Jack, you guys are here. We finally got everybody in the same room together. You guys maybe don't know this, but I have separately bought whole boxes of your books and I give them out to people like left and right. It's just, thank God somebody has written your books, but somehow you guys found time to write a book together. So first tell me, how did you guys like make this decision, given everything you've done in the world, to write another book?
I mean, it was a mutually agreed upon decision. We had been toying with the idea of writing a book for years. Lisa and I were book writing buddies. Like I went on her podcast for one of the many times, and afterwards she's like, "I really want to write a book. We should do it together." And I was like, "Yeah, we should. Let's do it." And then she was roped in. So while I was writing Real Food for Pregnancy, she was writing The Fifth Vital Signs. We met weekly for at least a year. Wow. And we that's how like secretly we were vetting each other to see if we would be appropriately matched to write a book together. She had wanted me to write a book on PCOS, and I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. And then, we I don't know.
Yeah,
It was
I don't remember the
necessary.
moment. I feel like it must have been an ongoing conversation for a while, but we always joke. I was like, Lily, there's no one else I could write a book with because we do have very similar styles of writing. I think the readers will appreciate that. We didn't keep it distracting, so it's kind of seamless. If people know us, they'll kind of know likely which sections we wrote, but otherwise they wouldn't necessarily see that distinction. So that's pretty rare. And then also our approach to research is very similar as well. So it's just, yeah, I'm really glad we were able to pull it off.
You know, so the new book, for those listening, you probably saw it in the podcast description, but Real Food for Fertility. This is different from Lisa's sort of, I don't know, your best-selling The Fifth Vital Sign, and Lily's best-selling Real Food for Pregnancy. Of course, there was also Real Food for Gestational Diabetes. Since we have an hour together, I'm just going to get into it. Why did we need this book? Like you guys wrote these beautiful books. What is new that you guys were able to put together in synthesis that is going to be expressed in this book that people are not going to get in the other books?
Well, I mean, I can share my take on it. I felt like because we wrote our books at the same time, Lily writing Real Food for Pregnancy and me writing The Fifth Vital Sign. So we each really knew the content of the other. And what I found is that I felt that every single client that I worked with needed her book as well. So, I wanted obviously for my conception clients and my clients who would conceive to get Real Food for Pregnancy, but I was always recommending her book to women, and some for whom don't even want to get pregnant at all, because of the solid dietary foundation. Because of course, in order to optimize menstrual cycle health, balance hormones, the dietary foundations in Real Food for Pregnancy and now Real Food for Fertility are the way to go. So for me, I was always recommending it, and I feel like Lily, it might have been your idea for us to do it. I feel like it might have been initially you. I don't know. Am I wrong on that?
I honestly don't remember because the last 3 years of working on this are a complete blur. For me though, I could say I would be recommending with people who are like, hey, I'm thinking about having a baby. Do you have a book on fertility? And no, apply the principles from Real Food for Pregnancy and also read Lisa's book, because you need to make sure you get the timing right and know your cycle and identify your cycle issues and hormonal issues through that, and then address them like preconception. But then like the questions keep coming. Well, what about, I'm struggling with PCOS, hypothalamic amenorrhea, all these specific things. And it's like, yeah, those are like, they are addressed in Lisa's book, but there's an additional nutritional component that may not go into as much detail as people want. I mean, for better or for worse, people come to my work because they want the ridiculously detailed answer, which even with Real Food for Fertility, I was like, we went like there's just too much information. Like it's too in depth. I found myself kind of like pulling back at the end. But then when I go back and read through it and the types of questions that I get from people, it's all asking these really ridiculously nitty-gritty specific questions. And I'm really glad that we put in all of that detail in there because we wanted a resource to answer all of those questions. For
Yeah.
me, like I would have people who have everything dialed in, but they are not thinking about like the male component, or they don't know how to identify their fertile window and time sex for conception. And they needed not only Lisa's book, but they needed a book on sperm quality. So we threw in a super detailed
Amen.
chapter on sperm quality. It's like 3 books in one. You know, you get the nutrition for fertility, you get the menstrual cycle stuff, you get the sperm quality stuff.
Yeah. Which I think is where when I get like 10 DMs a day about various things related to what I do. And I'm generally just referring people, to your guys' work. I mean, Lily, we'll talk about organ meats and stuff in a little bit, but I don't know how many times I have sent people to your blog on organ meats. Like, it has to be in the hundreds. Like, I have it saved as a bookmark on my phone because I use it so much. So the point here is I think a lot of people are really, really compelled to take some control over this journey, right? Now, of course, there's a lot of things out of your control in the fertility, pregnancy, birth space, but the nutritional stuff is in our sort of quarters. Like, this is something that we can take responsibility for. And when people start to assume that way of showing up, let's bear in mind that, the assisted reproductive technology industry is raking in, like, it's going to be eclipsing $3 billion in the coming years, annually. And up to 15% per the literature of couples report some sort of fertility challenge, meaning, in my eyes, like, it's not as easy as I thought it was going to be. So people, hear that IVF, for example, is going to cost 15 grand. And suddenly they're like, holy shit, maybe there's something I can do to actually save us that money. And a $25 purchase on Amazon is a good starting point, or a free blog written by either of you on tracking or on organ meats. So when you hear your stories, as I have, from various families and women and men, they're probably coming to you in that sort of similar scenario. What do you think is lacking from what they're actually experiencing within the allopathic model? It seems like a softball question, but maybe you can just try to summarize it in the way that you would say it on an elevator.
I think from my perspective, what's lacking from the allopathic model is any awareness of the menstrual cycle whatsoever, any awareness of how a woman's fertility works. So there's a whole lot to say about those things. I mean, the things that I often talk about is the lack of awareness just in the basics. You're not fertile every single day. There's a fertile window that we can identify by tracking your cervical mucus, your basal body temperature, those fertile signs. And also your fertility changes with age. You're not going to have the same exact fertility as you would at 20 when you're in your 40s. And it's like we can't, or we're not having that conversation. We're not, these couples are not aware of the role of male factor. We've already mentioned that. That's a pretty big deal. And the way women live their lives at this stage in time is that we are typically avoiding pregnancy, of course, in our late teens and our early 20s. And we're often using hormonal methods for that, but we're not getting educated about how those methods work and how they may affect fertility, compounded by how your fertility changes over time.
Right.
So,
Right.
when you get into your mid to late 30s, most women aren't aware that when you come off the pill, there's a delay. There's not always a delay to pregnancy, but what we know for sure is that you're more likely to, there's a study that I cite all the time that it showed that women coming off of combined contraceptives who had been on for 2 years or more took twice as long to conceive. So everybody doesn't have a long delay to conception, but some women do. And we know that it has a negative effect. And so when I think about what some of my goals are and my hopes are for Real Food for Fertility, it's that we're catching people early. We're catching them young. We're catching them before. I mean, I want to catch them at any stage, right? So if you're
Yeah.
already in the midst of
Maybe.
trying,
Or
the book
45.
is for you.
Yeah.
But we want to catch all women. And to go with your question around, what's lacking and that idea of getting people at the start of their journey, if we can educate women and couples about their fertility and about this idea of the trajectory even of your reproductive life from your 20s and 30s and how it changes, then it sets you up for success in a different way. So it's kind of like the book that I wish I had when I, first met my husband, before we were even married, when we were talking about it, because there's a lot of things that we would have totally been down to do.
Yeah.
We knew we were going to start our family, shortly after we got married, but we just didn't have the information.
Right. Right. Anything you want to add there, Lily? Thank you, Lisa.
Well, even if assisted reproductive technology is needed, and sometimes it's not, because we haven't even exhausted the options to help promote
Right.
natural conception ahead of time. A lot of times we're not even identifying issues with a woman's cycle, which would be totally obvious if she was charting. I mean, I don't know how many people I know who sought treatment with IVF, and really what was probably going on is they were not ovulating. Like, they had hypothalamic amenorrhea from being an over exerciser, over dieter. And
Yeah.
you
Fasting, prolonged
Yeah, and
fasting.
so that it's possible that that could have been resolved with nutrition and lifestyle intervention versus having to go on, medications to force ovulation, all the things, right? But even when those are used, because there's, time and a place where it, of course, is like the only option for conception for some, we can optimize the chances that it actually
Love that.
results in a viable pregnancy by preparing you ahead of time. Like, even the thickness of your endometrium can determine whether or not implantation is going to be successful or not. And that has a lot to do with what you're doing in the months leading up to conception. And not only that, we know like pregnancy complications are far more common for pregnancies conceived via IVF. And if we're optimizing your health ahead of time, we can lessen your risk of some of these complications later on. I mean,
Yeah.
regardless of how you've conceived, really, we can lessen the complications later on, because so many of the biggest obstetrical complications come down to an issue with placentation. Like, the placenta did not properly form or embed itself in the uterine wall well. And that has to go all the way back to preconception health, not only of mom, but of dad too, because
Yeah.
sperm plays a role in the health of the placenta. So we got to like rewind the clock if we want to optimize not only conception, but the viability and success and health of a pregnancy. Rewind the clock a while, and that's really the time to intervene. That's the message that I didn't really harp on much in Real Food for Pregnancy, because you're picking up the book because you're pregnant. Just like in the Gestational Diabetes book, I'm not harping on all the things to do to prevent gestational diabetes. You pick up the book because you have the complication. Like, this is what to do now. This book is targeting like, here's what you do ahead of time to hopefully prevent the complication in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, I will never say that we shouldn't be doing IVF and IUI. There are certainly good reasons to be doing that. The number of women and the ease with which people who train to do what I do are referring people to the REI clinic without anybody ever even giving somebody a copy of a book like yours, to me is, I'm not going to say it's like, shame on you or anything. It just seems like it's a missed opportunity, for us to say, hey, listen, even if you end up there, what about the myriad of complications that result as a consequence of us not having looked upstream as to the true issues relating to either recurrent miscarriage or blighted ovums, that are happening, routinely, or you're simply not ovulating and you're not able to conceive. So I see this as like a marriage of two very, very important, it's not even philosophies. It's two very important bodies of research that you guys have put together in a really a succinct volume. It's a compendium, really, with a number of resources and references you guys make. And of course, we could look at this at any step of the way. So I think we should talk about the male factor, which I suspect is far more than 50%. I'm actually thinking it's 60 to 70% of the time we actually have poor men's health playing into this. Now, every clinician is going to say something differently, and Harvard's going to say something very differently. But let's pause on the sperm conversation. Let's talk about, instead of looking at the myriad of things from dysbiosis in the vagina and cervix and endometrial cavity, in the endometrial lining and the fallopian tubes, there's so many factors that can play in here. Let's talk about what everybody talks about, which is egg quality. And I'll share just a little snippet. I was just at the Harvard OBGYN review. I do it every year for CMEs. It's like 60 CMEs. And they have all the smartest people talking to us dumb people about what the latest and greatest is. And they maintain that AMH, anti-Mullerian hormone, which is supposed to be a reflection of the number of viable, potentially ovulatable and conceivable eggs, that this AMH number is going to decline over time. There's nothing we can do about it. And yet in my practice, which by the way is highlighted by books like yours, now I just have one I can send instead of overloading the box with 2 books, but I have seen AMHs double, triple, quadruple within about 2 to 3 months. So what's going on there? Like when we talk about egg quality, what are women actually supposed to understand about that? And how can we utilize some basic principles of diet, nutrition, lifestyle, etc., to improve the quote quality of your eggs? I don't even really like the term, but if you guys could riff on that just a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I can dive into a little bit of the AMH conversation there. I find the research on AMH to be really fascinating. That was one of the sections Lily and I had a lot of back and forth on, the question of how much detail do we need to include. But when I'm working with clients, this comes up a lot because I've had a number of clients who, if their AMH numbers are low, they're being told that they won't be able to conceive naturally, or they're being told that that means they're going to go into an early menopause. And I think the most interesting thing about the research around AMH is that it doesn't really indicate either of those things conclusively. So, AMH is released by the growing pool of follicles, so every time you approach ovulation in a menstrual cycle, you start that menstrual cycle with a little pool of follicles. And as they develop and grow, eventually one is selected to reach maturity. So with ovarian reserve markers such as AMH or antral follicle count, these are giving us an indirect measure of the reserve, which is actually the quantity of eggs, and giving us some insight potentially into, how long we have remaining. Because of course, as women, our
Right.
reproductive lifespan is finite. But it doesn't, what I find to be just really infuriating is that there's kind of a pretty clear consensus in the research that AMH is not useful to predict a woman's chances of natural conception, because you have these
Right.
studies where, a woman may have quite low AMH or even undetectable AMH and still conceive. And so it's actually a useful marker, but it's most useful when it's used for artificial reproductive technology, because there's a high correlation between that AMH number and whether or not the IVF will be successful. So if the AMH number is too low, it's reflecting that that little pool of follicles in the ovary that's developing is also smaller, and for that particular cycle. And so if you do an IVF retrieval procedure, you're less likely to get a good yield. And so it's actually most useful for that purpose. And I wouldn't say that that means that the number doesn't matter. I think there is a correlation, between the AMH and, quality in general, but it's not the sentence that it's made out to be, and it's not as conclusive
Right.
as it's meant to be. So in terms of, how would I look at that? I've also seen AMH numbers improve, and we cite some research. We cite some key nutrients and supplements to support egg quality, and there's research showing that, there was a study that used high dose vitamin D. They gave the participants vitamin D towards the beginning of the cycle. And, the AMH number significantly improved over the course of the study. We have research showing that it's not fixed. That's actually another interesting thing I've heard a lot of clients say, where their, healthcare provider will tell them, okay, well, your AMH is low, and it must be low because your grandma's AMH was low too, and it's fixed,
Right.
and there's nothing you can
It's
do to change it.
inherited.
And
Yeah.
all of these things are not the truth about it. So
Right.
one of the things that we tried to do in our egg quality chapter was to make that distinction between this concept of quantity and ovarian reserve. We have these measures that are giving us, it's always an indirect measure of how many eggs we have left. So there is this correlation between AMH and, as we go through our reproductive lifespan, it's higher, it's going to be higher in our 20s. and then it starts to gradually drop until we actually hit menopause. But it doesn't mean that it's this direct correlation. We can't go into the ovaries,
Right.
slice them open, and count the follicles. It's always an indirect measure. And the fact that, for example, a woman with PCOS, the fact that her AMH is going to be higher if she has multiple follicles in her ovary. And, we know that it's lower in women with endometriosis, for example, and there's other factors that can contribute. We know that it can change. Like you said, you've seen it change in your practice when you change the lifestyle and, other nutritional factors and et cetera. So we know it's not this static thing. So I feel that we need to have more of a conversation about what the practical applications of this marker are, so that we don't keep freaking women out and having them think that just because the number's low, it's unchangeable, and it's
Yeah.
definitely means that they can't conceive. And I think then, to your question about quality, what we need to really focus on is what we have control over. We don't have control over how many eggs we have in our ovaries. That's not a thing that we have control over. But what we do have control over is our approach to supporting egg quality. And so we can certainly focus on the nutritional aspects. One of the interesting facts about our eggs is that they house more mitochondria than any other cell in the body.
Oh, wow.
So, Nathan, do you have a guesstimate of how many mitochondria we have? I don't know if you've read that part of the book.
I mean, I read most of
In
your
one
book,
egg cell.
but in one egg cell, let me guess. So what's in like a typical muscle cell, just to have a
So
reference?
I don't know the number for all the cells, but let's say in the liver and heart cells, there may be a few thousand.
Okay, because when I was in residency and I was being hit with a question in front of all of the, attendings and whatnot, I would give the most bullshit answer, and I would always say 6. Every single time I would just
That's
say
so
6.
funny. Did I
So
just give you like trauma?
yeah, yeah. It
Like
was more like
PTSD?
they're just watching me squirm up here. I have no idea. And if I say it off by a couple, they're still going to say I'm wrong. So I just would say 6, and they would drive them nuts. But
Well, I like to ask the question for someone who doesn't know, because what I find, like when I think back to my like junior high
yeah,
experience of bio, they would show us the cell in the textbook, and I feel like it had 1 or 2 mitochondria in it.
yeah,
And I
yeah,
feel like that was my representation of the egg. So the human egg cell is the largest cell in the body. We can see it with the naked eye.
yeah, that's
It's
right.
about the size of a period on a piece of paper, and it houses anywhere from 100,000 to 600,000 mitochondria
Holy smokes. Within the
in a
cell
single
cytoplasm of a
egg.
single egg.
Yeah.
Wow.
And if you think about that, well, it's kind of like in retrospect, well, duh, it's making a human. So of course
Yeah.
it would, right? Like
Yeah.
it does
A
some
lot of
pretty heavy
activity in
lifting,
there.
right? And it's the maternal mitochondria that continue. When the sperm meets the egg, the
Yeah.
male mitochondria don't continue on. So from that perspective, I mean, it's really fascinating reading these studies and learning all this information. Just gives me such a greater appreciation to how our bodies work. But what we can take from that, from a practical standpoint, is the heart of supporting egg quality, obviously, is about finding ways to support our mitochondria. And I know, Lily, you can speak a ton to that with our nutritional and supplemental approach.
You just set that up so beautifully.
Like you guys are
For me to
listening
just
Thank you.
jump right
amazing.
in. I can just like list some nutrients and like my work is done. Yeah, the supporting mitochondrial health is huge. I recently spoke at Metabolic Health Summit, and my talk was called "Metabolic Health Starts in Utero." Technically, it starts preconception, but you know what I mean. I was speaking to the pregnancy aspect. We inherit our mitochondria for our mom. So if a mom has dysfunctional mitochondrial health, that's what that baby is going to end up inheriting. And of course, how she lives her life during her pregnancy plays a role in this as well. But we have to look at, what do the mitochondria need to function well? How efficient are they? And a big aspect to that is making sure that you're getting enough micronutrients in there and you're not overwhelming the body with a whole bunch of energy, but low micronutrient intake, so your body can't actually make use of those calories. For example, if you eat like excessive amounts of sugar with a low intake of micronutrients, your mitochondria can literally experience something called glucotoxicity. This is a problem. So we need that nutrient density. So a number of nutrients are important for the mitochondria. Basically, all of the B vitamins, folate, B12, B6, B2, B1, and so on, choline, inositol, vitamin E, so antioxidants. Anytime there's a lot of energy metabolism happening, there's going to be a byproduct of some oxidative stress. So any of your antioxidant nutrients like vitamin E, vitamin C, taurine, it's an amino acid, but it really functions pretty much as an antioxidant in many areas of the body. Alpha lipoic acid, CoQ10, and then of course we need a huge number of minerals to support our metabolic health as well. Magnesium, iron, zinc, copper, iodine, selenium, and so forth. So the area that I find that we need to focus the most on for supporting maternal mitochondrial health is getting those micronutrients up. And where do you find most of those micronutrients? Primarily in our protein-rich foods, and then our like antioxidant-rich plant foods. So animal foods and some high-quality plants. When you're eating that way, and you're eating foods like the way they came in nature, where you're not taking out all of the fat obsessively, you're not refining the grains to take out all the, fiber and nutrients that were in the bran. If you are consuming those carbohydrates, oftentimes they're like fermented, right? Traditional sourdough has like a long fermentation. You actually enhance the nutritional value of the resulting bread. It has more protein, has more B vitamins, has some probiotics, and it also has a significantly lower glycemic index, right? Eating in this way, you're maximizing the micronutrients, the amino acid and protein content, and you're minimizing the amount of like excess energy and energy coming without micronutrients. Kind of speaking a little bit high level here, but the state of affairs in the US, and I think a big reason we have such an issue with infertility, is that 58% of American calories are coming from ultra-processed foods these days. It's the absolute opposite of a nutrient-dense food. They have virtually no micronutrients. These are just foods made from refined sugars, refined starches, and like low quality vegetable seed oils, whatever you want to call them, plus the slew of chemicals and additives and things that make them actually taste like something that they're not. Because if they didn't have those flavorings and other ingredients, they would really taste no good and nobody would want to eat them. But that's the elephant in the room we're up against, is we need all these things for healthy, functional mitochondria and functional ability to make use of the energy we're consuming, and yet the majority of the energy we're consuming is in the form of these ultra-processed foods. So the biggest thing you can do to support egg quality is shifting away from the ultra-processed foods. I don't even care how the diet shifts. Bring in more whole foods. By default, you will be consuming less of the ultra-processed foods because you won't have the hunger and appetite for them. Yeah. And particularly when you're focusing on the protein-rich foods and setting the stage for fullness and satiety and filling that void for the protein that your body so desperately needs and those micronutrients, your blood sugar levels regulate, and then your hunger and appetite regulates as well. And it's just a natural default without having to force anything on anybody.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that is probably enough for a person to try to digest in. If you were to take a step back and look at your lifestyle, what you guys have just said there for the male and the female, I think it's going to be equally applicable. And sometimes I'll even tell people, listen, okay, you don't want to give up some of the processed stuff. Let's start adding some healthy things, and then we'll slowly start, getting you out of that sort of habituated behavior that it took you 30 years to get to. But we'll get into some specific foods. One thing I wanted to add before we move on to sperm quality is that the various cytochrome processes within the inner layer of the mitochondria are also gunked up by a variety of what we would call toxic things. Now, I'm not talking about the toxins that are just the buzzwords everywhere. I mean, very, very directly, there are things that can also inhibit some of these processes that help to optimize aerobic respiration within these very, very active cells. So I just want to also point out to people that these other environmental factors are also just as relevant, meaning the quality of your food is just as relevant as to what you are eating from a macro or micro standpoint. So I'll just leave it at that so we can get on. But let's talk about egg quality now. Or not egg quality. We just talked about egg quality. Sperm quality, which, like I said before, I'm pretty certain that most men are not being given the opportunity to become just as accountable as the many women who are carrying this burden of, quote, infertility, or what we can call maybe subfertility, as they're on this journey. So let's talk about what men can do in order to partner up with their female partner, assuming we have a male and a female having a baby here. Let's talk about what men can do in order to optimize their chances of conceiving naturally.
Well, I think it's a broad topic. The first thing I would say is I always like to joke, but it's kind of, they say there's always truth in joke, that we just need to put men on blast, and involve them. And I always joke because, again, there's truth in the joke, that I have 3 children, 9 or 8, 11, and 1. And I'm the one that carried them for 9 months. I'm the one that pushed them out without any epidural or whatever. Yeah, I felt that. Ha ha ha. And but anyways, they all came out looking just like their dad. So I always start by sharing that joke because it kind of orients us to the fact that yes, your partner is responsible for 50% of the genetic material. You have already shared some of the stuff. I don't remember if we shared this on air or before our call, but we do know that male factor infertility, according to the statistics, is playing a role either solely or, together combined with the female factor issues 50% of the time. So half of the time, if there's fertility challenges, it's related to male factor. And we also know by looking at the research that if you have a couple who's been trying to conceive, let's say for a year or 2 or more, that if you were to take those men and test their parameters on average wouldn't be as great as the parameters of the men whose partners were able to successfully conceive, within that first year.
Like which
So
parameters, Lisa? Just you can be very, very explicit.
yeah, I mean, when I say sperm parameters, I think the most commonly looked at include things like morphology, which is a measure of what they actually look like. So if you were to look at a sperm under a microscope, you think if you picture what you think it looks like, you picture like a round head and a tail. And so if the sperm has a normal morphology, that's what it's going to look like. But if the morphology is abnormal, then a certain percentage of them are going to have a variety of issues, whether it's squashed head or no tail or whatever the
Two
case is.
tails and it's spinning in circles. Yeah.
Yeah, we actually used some of the images from the World Health Organization It's a really interesting. The 2010 World Health Organization document is where we get our sperm parameters from. That's what they use. So if someone's listening and their partner has been tested, if you were to look at the result, that's where that information comes from. And that document's like 100 pages or whatever, but it's really interesting. And they have images of sperm under the microscope, and they show you the difference between the normal and the abnormal. So in our book, we have a kind of like a brief rendition so that you can actually visually see the difference. So morphology is one of the factors. Obviously, count, concentration, so how many sperm per milliliter, how many million per milliliter sperm, and motility. So whether they're swimming, if they're swimming forward, if they're just moving at all. And so those are some of the most common parameters that are looked at. And so generally speaking, if you have a couple who's been trying to conceive for quite some time, if we were to look at the sperm parameters on average of those men, they're just not up to par in comparison. So the reason I share this is because we have to know that it plays a crucial role. And one of the reasons that this became front and center in my work is because, I'm working with women with the menstrual cycle. We're going through fertility awareness techniques to optimize conception, and of course, every woman that I work with thinks it's solely her issue. And so I've had a number of clients whose menstrual cycles are actually pretty good. They look okay. They fall into normal parameters and they understand timing. So they're timing sex correctly. And you have to keep in mind, like when I started charting myself, I mean, I was in my late teens. So I was in the actively avoiding camp. So when you're in that perspective, it's just like, you don't even want the sperm in the room with you when you're in your fertile window, because you grew up learning that you could get pregnant on any day of your cycle, right? All the myths that we learn. So going into working with couples who are struggling with fertility and seeing that they're actually having sex at the perfect time in their cycle to conceive month after month after month after month and nothing's happening, and her cycle looks okay, we really start to have to look at his sperm quality. And what I have found is that when I'm in that situation and he's willing to get his sperm analyzed, chances are the sperm actually isn't optimal. You know,
Mm.
I've rarely, if ever, seen that. So, to answer the question of like what can men do, like there's a whole conversation about it. I'm sure we'll get into more details, but I think the first thing that your partner could do is get a sperm analysis, especially if you've been trying to conceive. And I would say if you take some time, learn a little bit about timing, you're having sex at the correct time, I would say that it's we really encourage you to consider if he's open to it, if he's open to it, and if he's willing to do that, to get that test done earlier than later. Because if you identify that his parameters are suboptimal, it takes a minimum of 3 months, but I would say realistically 4 to 6 months after he starts making those implementing those changes to really see those changes show up in the sperm analysis itself. So this is something that takes a little bit of time, and it's a lot worse if you've been trying to conceive for a year or two before he even gets tested,
Right.
only to determine then that there was an issue.
Right. Lily, I'm going to bring you in here as well, but I want to go back to what we had talked about with egg quality. Like some of these clients that I've had, triple or quadrupling of their AMH, which was like, it seemed like it was the only thing that their OB/GYN was concerned about. They're still not necessarily going to get pregnant. And then, of course, the man, it's like, well, okay, let's revisit what you're doing. You look at the semen analysis, and sometimes it's nowadays only reported as greater than 20 million per cc concentration of sperm. And that's it. And they're like, you're off the hook. But frankly, and I was looking at the 2010 WHO report on the handling of sperm. It's like 292 pages long, by the way. And one of their sort of their little tables there describes that it's now down to 15 million sperm per cc as the lower end of normal. And I would suspect, given that it's not just one egg, one sperm, and people can disagree with me on that, but you need hundreds of thousands, if not millions of sperm being flushed up towards the fallopian tube for conception to happen. Otherwise, when you do IVF, you would just get the healthiest sperm. We would find some way to do that and magically get the rhinos to meet in the petri dish. And it doesn't work like that. So anyways, the reason I'm bringing this up is 50 years ago, that concentration of sperm within the ejaculate would probably have been considered a big problem. But nowadays, men are just kind of getting off the hook. And I'm not saying this to be like, to say that men are the bad guy. But what I'm saying is, guys, what your doctor is telling you as, hey, you're fine, could probably be tripled or quadrupled with some basic lifestyle modifications, which is naturally going to increase the chances of you guys conceiving naturally. That's all I'm going to say. So,
Do you want
Lily,
me to
do you want
comment on that?
to
That's like
please
a whole
comment
big
on
can
that?
of
Yeah,
worms
that's
you
the
just
whole
opened.
thing.
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I'll just share a few things. But I think when I bring this topic up, because the reality is that not all men are comfortable, doing this. So I think we kind of have to make our case when we're bringing this up. And I think that you mentioned quite a few things, but one of the things that you touched on is the fact that what we consider normal now is not the same as what it was before.
That's right.
So if we were to take your average man today, based on what we're seeing in the research, average man may have a sperm concentration of about 50 million sperm per milliliter, like at this stage, this point in time.
Yeah.
But if we look at some of the older studies, I'm always fascinated by the studies in like the 40s, like they studied interesting things back then. But if we were to look at some studies back then, the average man had over 100 million sperm per milliliter. So there was this one
No
study,
doubt.
and the average man had a sperm concentration of 113 million per milliliter. So what the lower parameter is now, like you said, 15 million sperm per milliliter, according to the 2010 WHO document. If your partner's sperm is above that, it's considered to be normal. And that's literally a tenth of what the sperm parameters were of an average man in the 40s. And you might, whenever I say that, people are like, what's going on? And so what we did is we took a look at the actual study where this 2010 like where they got their information to create these parameters. It's a really interesting study. They took just under 2,000, couples, and they basically had all these couples. I think the total was actually closer to 4,000. But out of this cohort of couples, they looked at which couples conceived within 1 year. And I think that cohort was just under
Mm,
2,000. And then they took the semen analysis of those couples who had conceived in 1 year. And then if you go back to math class for a minute, they put them in two centiles. So you can, if want to look at the study, 5%, 10%, 50%, they went through the whole centiles. And so those 2010 parameters are based on the lower fifth centile. So out of that group of men, whose partners conceived within 1 year of trying, they took the lower fifth centile. So 95% of the men in that particular study would have had semen parameters better than the number that they chose. And, I think that they have their reasons for doing that. When you're choosing these kind of standard lab ranges, it seems that they are wanting to select a number that isn't so high that then everybody is considered ill, or you're kind of identifying people that could have a health issue that are potentially okay. So I think they have a different bar for how they're selecting it. But that tells us a whole lot about what
mhm.
this means. So when you're trying to conceive and your partner did the analysis, and you're told by the healthcare professionals that everything's fine. My favorite word, fine. It's fine. He's fine. We're all fine. Um, what that means is that he, met that lower parameter. So it's 15 million sperm per milliliter. If it's over that, it's fine. 40% motility. And what that means is 40% are moving. So does that
Yeah.
mean 60% or not? And then 4% normal morphology, which means 4% are like the round head and the tail, and 96% have morphological abnormalities that look really questionable in a
Mm,
lot of cases. So, there's we shared that and compared it to a different study, and the researchers in that study were asking a different question. So they were looking at couples, and they were saying, okay, at what point do the sperm parameters start to have a negative impact on time to conception? And what they found were optimal parameters was a sperm concentration of 48 million sperm per milliliter, motility number of 63%, and then a morphology number of 12%. And so what we're arguing essentially, in our sperm chapter, which could be like a mini sperm book, the sperm quality book, is that, what is lost in the conversation is this kind of subfertile gray area. So a lot of these men that are being told they're totally fine when they're doing their semen analysis, and then, the emphasis is put right back on the woman. A lot of these men are in this subfertile gray area where their parameters may be high enough to surpass that 2010 World Health Organization kind of low bar parameter, but they're not high enough to fall into optimal parameters for natural conception. And when you're in that kind of subfertile range, it doesn't mean you won't be able to get pregnant, like period, full stop. But what it can mean is that it can take a lot longer. It
a
can
lot
delay the
longer.
time to conception.
Yeah, let me just add something to that, because as you were saying that, you kind of answered the sort of question as to what I was sort of pontificating. But I suspect that based on just the language of that WHO report, I suspect that they were trying to give the bare minimum in order to have a reasonable expectation of a successful IVF. I think that that's where those parameters
I
probably
believe
came
that
from.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I
Because if
don't know
it's
that for
below
sure.
that, it would be harder. That's
Yeah,
often how I explain to clients. Like if the numbers were below that, it might even be harder to have a successful artificial reproductive scenario.
right.
So certainly not meant to represent optimal
Right.
parameters.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. So in other words, if a man and a woman go to their REI doc or the urologist, they do a semen analysis and they say, "Hey, you're fine. You might be fine based on our parameters for successful IVF, or at least reasonable success with IVF, but not necessarily if you're trying to conceive naturally." Um, so Lily, can you chime in on this a little bit? We have 8 minutes left according to your clock. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about what nutritional support we can provide, or other lifestyle factors for men if we want to boost sperm counts,
Yeah, for
and
sure.
motility and volume and all the other things, not just count.
Well, the good news is there's a lot of overlap between nutrition to support egg quality and nutrition for sperm quality. So people ask me, well, do I need to cook like separate things for my husband or my partner? And it's like, well, not necessarily, because the same things are beneficial to both. I mean, maybe a little extra emphasis on some zinc and selenium, like really pushing the seafood on him would be
Yeah.
great. But no, there's a lot of overlap. So antioxidant like nutrients tend to be pretty helpful. Your selenium, your vitamin E, your vitamin C, your alpha lipoic acid, I believe we have some decent research on. And then we're looking at things to support our own endogenous production of antioxidants. So things that support glutathione synthesis, our liver's major antioxidant, like N-acetylcysteine. And by the way, cysteine is just, it's an amino acid. You find it in whole foods as well. So cysteine-rich foods are, for the most part, primarily animal-sourced foods. So getting plenty of animal protein hits that mark. Carnitine is another amino acid really helpful for sperm quality and egg quality also, and a whole host of reproductive issues. There's tons of research on L-carnitine. Very good for your metabolism. But carnitine is richest in red meat. So your red meat hits the carnitine. It certainly can be a supplemental thing on the side. Getting vitamin D in a healthy range, folate and other B vitamins, omega-3 fatty acids. Again, that's one of the reasons seafood can be so beneficial. Did I mention CoQ10 and vitamin A? Vitamin A you'd be getting from your liver and organ meats. You also get some from other animal foods, but much lesser concentrations. Those are some of the top ones that you want to hit. And then you want to be avoiding the things that are creating more oxidative stress in your system. So the refined carbohydrates and ultra-processed foods that we already talked about, the low-quality vegetable oils, the fried foods, excessive alcohol, caffeine, smoking. And then, of course, there's non-nutritional factors for men specifically, like avoiding overheating your testicles, for example, or like squashing them by being like an endurance cyclist. Wi-Fi, radiation,
Cell phone
EMF.
right in our pocket next to our
Yep.
testicles. Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
having a laptop on your lap where it's overheating you, synthetic underwear instead of like cotton or wool or other natural fibers. All of those things, make a difference. I mean, and more, but exercise, movement, there's kind of like a sweet spot where a little bit of exercise is good. You go crazy, excessive ultra endurance, and you're going to be at least temporarily lowering your parameters. But on the flip side, being totally sedentary is also not great. So there's kind of like a sweet spot for exercise and movement that also plays a role. So a lot of that, again, there's carryover with female hormones as well, because there's kind of a Goldilocks amount of exercise that's beneficial for women. And then in some camps, you overdo it and you can disrupt the cycle. In other groups of people, like women with PCOS, getting a little extra movement at a slightly higher intensity actually improves their metabolic health. So kind of, the prescription depends on the person and what their, default mode is.
Yeah. Yeah. Gosh, guys, I wish we had another whole hour here. Why don't we try to see if the stars can align and we can create more time for ourselves? And we'll try to do a part 2, because there is so much here that we haven't even gotten into. But if people listening want to go and get your book, they're going to learn a little bit about PCO spectrum disorder. They're going to learn a little bit about what, Lisa, you and I have gone over this in the Born Free community as well, this pesky luteal phase defect thing that everybody's talking about. Changes to cervical fluid and what maybe some nutritional things can do to support that, and some of our other hormone imbalances. There is so much that you guys bring into this space, and I am very, very, very grateful that we're able to find time, at least for egg and sperm quality alone, which is going to, the stuff that you guys have recommended is going to make a myriad of differences for how a person's sort of optimal expression of life is going to just kind of unfold going forward, whether or not they conceive naturally or through IVF or one of these other ARTs. So my final question for you is, if you had to tell people 3 things to do nutritionally, we've already talked about the processed food, so get the junk out, but what are 3 things you want people to add to their diet, whether they are seeing issues on their fertility awareness tracking, or they're struggling to conceive naturally, or they're preparing for IVF, I guess?
I guess I'll take that one since it's a food one. Well, we talked about organ meats, so organ meats for sure.
Mm-hmm. Specifically
just
beef liver, that's your favorite?
I mean, they're all good, they all have their own little nutritional perks. So like
Yeah.
liver happens to be richest in vitamin A, and I think it has just a particularly comprehensive nutrient breakdown. But like heart is richest in CoQ10, kidneys are richest in selenium. They have an acquired taste, so you're forewarned. They have different qualities that are, there's benefits to them all. But some organ meats, usually most people end up going to liver. But if you go to heart, it's just like it's like a very lean steak. It's a muscle, right? So that's an easier flavor. We have a recipe for beef heart stew in the book. Up on my blog, I have a Thai chili beef heart skewers. You could marinate and skewer chicken hearts on like a kebab and roast them over the fire. That's like a delicacy in many parts of the world, and they're delicious. They're tender. So however you get the organ meats in, we see huge benefits in menstrual cycle health, also shown to improve sperm parameters as well. Some type of seafood, ideally a high omega-3, lower toxin seafood, and we talk about which choices kind of fit the bill for that. Highly nutrient dense and hitting the marks for many nutrients that do enhance egg and sperm quality and also just overall fertility. So your DHA, your vitamin D, your B12, your iodine, your selenium, your zinc, and so on and so forth. And then
would that be
I
like
don't know, I guess
the bivalves, like oysters, mussels, clams? Is that what
the bivalves are some that are particularly nutrient dense. They're almost like the organ meats of the sea in a way. So they're really, really high in B12, zinc, copper,
selenium,
selenium,
manganese, molybdenum,
a whole bunch of trace minerals, taurine. So I do recommend including those as part of your diet, as part of your like seafood component. So especially in individuals who aren't going to do organ meats, like people who are former vegetarians, for example, and they're just not going to do organ meats, do oysters and clams. They're like off the charts in your iron and zinc and a lot of the other nutrients you'd be missing out by not having organ meats. And I'm just going to be nice and throw in a non-animal food here is to include some fresh and colorful produce as well. We have to give a nod to the fact that really the majority of human cultures are omnivorous and they do eat whatever plants grow in their native community. So
the carnivores are going to be itching at this one. Yeah.
the carnivores, right? Hey, if you
carnivores.
feel great carnivore and everything checks out, I'm like not going to come after you. But generally speaking, we do see some benefits when you include some plant foods as well. And we have many different documented studies on the benefits of including plants. So the antioxidants, the folate, even the fiber. I know fiber even gets controversial nowadays, but fiber does help with the binding and excreting of hormones that have already been used up and are ready to be excreted, toxins that your liver has processed and dumped in your bile. Like they need to get bound to the fiber to be eliminated. There is such a thing as too much of a good thing. But generally speaking, the fiber coming from vegetables and fruits does not tend to have the detrimental effects that some other fibers can have on some individuals. So, throwing in all the caveats because that's how we roll. Those would be some of the top three, but there's, a whole chapter in Real Food for Fertility on foods to emphasize. We have meal plans and recipes showing how those might fit into an actual reasonable delicious diet and how to actually prepare them without spending your entire life in the kitchen. Because a lot of this ultimately, we can talk all this high level cerebral stuff. Ultimately, it only matters if you can implement it at home. So really your fertility starts in your own home, in your own kitchen, cooking more at home and learning to prepare things actually from scratch, like fewer things pre-prepared in packages that sadly just happen to come packaged with all sorts of garbage. And by the way, like never taste good. Like I try because I get sick of cooking to like, okay, you know what? I'm going to like put my ideals like on the shelf here and just get this thing pre-made because I'm too tired. And then I make it and I'm like, not only does this not taste good and cost way more, but I don't feel good for like 2-3 days after eating it. Like just not worth it. At the end of the day, I've not found a way to bypass spending some time in the kitchen. So we try to hold your hand through that process as well, because it all starts with like bringing in a little more nutrient dense foods to displace the processed stuff.
Totally, totally. Lisa, I have a final question for you if you guys have just 2 minutes, and that is going to be, what is the most important metric in fertility awareness tracking? But before that, I want to mention something we didn't get into, which was this estrogen dominance picture. It's amazing how many women, their hormones re-equilibrate when we add some extra fiber to their diet. And the reason is that it supports the gut microbiome. And there are certain dysbiosis patterns where you're going to get an expression of something called beta-glucuronidase, which actually cleaves a part of the excreted estrogens and allows it to be reabsorbed. So it may not be that your endocrine system is fucked. It might be that your gut is fucked, which of course many things can come back to the gut. But this is why a diversity of foods, especially if you're having issues, to reevaluate what you're eating. And even if it is something as simple as adding some extra fiber through a variety of different plants and whatnot, if that's what you do, that might be the only thing you have to do to fix this hormonal issue. So I just wanted to throw that in there. But of course, if people want to go deeper, please go get Real Food for Fertility. Lisa, oh, sorry. Did you want to say something else? Or Lisa, do you want to chime
No,
in?
I was trying to remember your question, but you were asking what the most important metric related to charting. I think
Maybe like if you had to pick one, I guess is my question, because a lot of people are like basal body temperature and cervical position. I have to stick my hands in there, and then cervical mucus and all of these things. What if somebody was to do just one? It's a bit of a cerebral, heady question.
It always depends on what your goals are. So, if you're trying to conceive, then the biggest takeaway that I can give you is to pay attention to your cervical fluid, because that is what tells you about timing. And the great thing about cervical fluid in relation to timing is that, so we produce cervical fluid. It comes out of the cervix itself. So the cervix is the opening to our uterus. It's where the baby comes out. And in the kind of inner canal of the cervix is where we have some folds, which we call our cervical crypts. And in those crypts, we have these specialized cells to make cervical mucus. So if you're observing this kind of creamy white stuff on your underwear, or you're observing the clear, stretchy kind of raw egg white type, or you're wiping occasionally when you go to the bathroom and you notice that it's really slippery, that kind of thing. So that would be your cervical fluid. So as you approach ovulation, you're producing cervical fluid in response to your rising estrogen levels. And this is all working together as you're approaching ovulation. Your follicles are making the estrogen. So it's all a wonderful, feedback loop that's happening. So what's happening in the cervix is that when you hit that fertile window, so outside of the window, you actually can't conceive. And part of the reason is because you have your cervix is blocked by a thick mucus plug. Most of the time when you hit that fertile window, your estrogen triggers the kind of breakdown of this plug. And then that's when your cervix is actually open. So I like to teach with silly analogies. So my analogy is the analogy of the bouncer in the nightclub. So, your mucus tells you when the bouncer is off duty or when it's on duty. So when you're actually observing this kind of creamy hand lotion type cervical fluid, like I said, if you're seeing it in your underwear, if you're noticing it when you're going to the bathroom, when you're wiping, or if you're seeing that kind of stretchy raw egg whites, that tells you that it's go time. Not all women necessarily see a large quantity, especially if they've had recent pill use or if they have a history of HPV and they may have had cervical surgeries that can impair mucus production. And so the other takeaway is that it's, in terms of timing specifically, the quantity is not relevant for timing. So even if all you observe is that kind of like, you notice that there's a few days where you actually feel kind of wet before around ovulation, or you're wiping and it's really slippery, but you don't necessarily produce enough to be seeing like this significant egg white quantity, like loads of it or whatever, as long as you can pick up that that's what you're observing, as long as you can pick up that change, I would time sex based on that. And I would do it regardless of when you're observing it. If you've just finished your period and you think, oh, it's too soon, I never ovulate this early, my best advice and biggest takeaway would be to really learn about your mucus and focus on that, and consider like a mucus first strategy for timing sex when you're actively trying to conceive. So when you see mucus, especially that mucus that's clear, stretchy, or that you have that lubricative sensation as you approach ovulation, have sex on those days. Learn how to confirm ovulation with your temperature. Like, you can add other things if you want to. If you like ovulation strips, use the mucus as the primary, and then the strips as the secondary kind of information.
Wonderful, guys. Thank you for flowing with me a little bit today and giving me some of your time. Where can people get Real Food for Fertility? Where do you prefer them go?
Well, so it's available on Amazon. They can head over there and type in Real Food for Fertility, and you'll get it there. We also have, if for any of the listeners who want some of our goodies, you can get the first chapter for free. We had over 2,400 citations in the book, and it's
That's
like
insane, by the way.
and that what's interesting about that, because like I think I'm a little bit neurotic, so each number is not corresponding to like one paper. Like sometimes that one number is corresponding to multiple papers depending on what was happening. So there's a lot of research. So for anyone who's a big research head, you can also get our our full research download, because it was 2,400 citations and what was it, like 200 pages. We did not put it in our already large book, but rest assured you can access all of those at realfoodforfertility.com. And you can also go there to find out information about Lily and myself. We each have practitioner programs. Lily has an amazing blog. I have a podcast. So if any of you wanting to catch up with us, that would be a great place to go to find out all the things that we're doing.
All right. Thank you, guys. Any final words, Lily? I know you've been patient. You had to leave 9 minutes ago, but any final words? we will end here.
I think Lisa covered it all. Yeah. Realfoodforfertility.com, and then find us on Instagram. We both have a ton of free resources available as well. So peruse her podcast, peruse my blog, scroll through our Instagrams. We have just tons of information out there.
Amazing. Thank you, ladies. I will get as many people to go and buy and read this book as I possibly can.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Thank you for having us.
You're very welcome.